Hello everyone. It's early, but I wanted to get in here before the studio is taken over by construction workers because I'm getting my radiator put in today or tomorrow, but I've had to resituate everything in the studio. Um, and as I have taken up painting in the last month, I don't know if you can see my palette back here. My easel is there, and then my screen printing stuff is everywhere else. So I wanted to touch upon not only the question of painting, but also something I touched upon in the last Small Night broadcast, which was this week, and it was on the new visual art program at Palace Projects Dublin, which is titled Do It Together rather than Do It Yourself. And in that critical reflection, I touched upon the question of community and also counterculture and how artist-run spaces, private institutions, public institutions, educational institutions, all these things are entangled in a network. And there's no real counterculture, and there never probably was in the arts. Um, Perhaps in times of desperation, maybe in the 70s, there was a sense that artists had to create alternatives to the museum or the white cube space. But really, what I'm interested in is the contradictions and how, when you state something like, as past projects do in the press release, the commercial self-interest of spaces like galleries, etc., you're putting yourself in a kind of position that is counter to the other kind of mainstream or established private or public institutions. And I think we're all entangled in this network. The minute we enter into it, the minute we accept a invitation to exhibit, the minute we get paid for something, the minute we get public funding, um, we're already institutionalized in some way. Um, I've yesterday I was promoting some things for Gorey School of Art because I've left Instagram and I had to go into the Gorey School of Art Instagram and do it. And I just something came up in my feed, and an artist was talking about being he wanted art fairs. He's a painter, so he wanted art fairs, the participation in art fairs to slow down. And I was just like, this is like the minute I enter this space, Instagram, we're faced with this kind of strange performativity. Um, I don't even know what that means, you know? Like, I know that a lot of artists would love to be, um, part of art fairs, etc. And we're mainly talking about painters here because these are the, this is um, the whatever you want to call it, it carries the weight. Painting carries the weight of the art fair. It actually facilitates everything else in the art fair as well. But like, anyway, I'm getting distracted, but it really comes into this question of individualism and community. And I touched upon Pass's use of the word community over and over again, especially in the first line. Community is mentioned three times. So if you want to see that, I said about 35-minute critical reflection. I talk about that in the intro. But strangely, I did mention that Palace, I'd worked with Palace before. Small Night Projects had their inaugural exhibition in Palace in 2018, 2019, just before COVID. Um, and I was commissioned also to write an essay there when they had the Dublin Painting Biennale or biennial. I don't think that ended up continuing, but um, In the name, it suggests that, and this is the Zagreb biennial. Anyway, I kind of forget the whole framework of it, but um, I ended up traveling to Zagreb with a group of painters that were part of the exhibition, and then I wrote an essay called Painter Painter, and the main argument in it was around community. Even though it talks about painting and it's something that I'm becoming more and more invested in as I start to take up painting again after a 15-year hiatus. Like here, all my books are coming out. It's weird when you start painting again, all your painting books come out and they're scattered around the studio, like Toma Apps, um, Tiapolo, like two of my favorite painters. So, like I'm a bit of a painting nerd in terms of art history. So Tiapolo and Correggio are two of my favorite painters, along with all the others like Raphael as well. But so yeah, I'm becoming more interested in painting, but also the criticism is looming in the background, especially when things like that on Instagram come into my lens, and also the Palace thing. So I'm going to read from this piece I wrote for Palace. I was commissioned to write. We also did a public conversation in Zagreb with a group of painters, and I brought up this idea in the talk about the painter versus the artist. And I always ask this question of painters: Do you see yourself as an artist or a painter? A lot of them will say they'll commit to painter rather than artist. I kind of like that distinction, even though artist broadly defines everything we do individual arts. So I'm going to read from this, and I may stop or pause during parts that I feel need to be elaborated on. I haven't read this since I wrote it, really. So it's weird going back to something that is that was 2021. It was in the middle of COVID. Um, we were all wearing masks on the plane. Or not on the plane, maybe on entering the plane. But anyway, not many people, I think, were wearing masks in Zagreb, which was strange. But yeah, I'm going to read from this and see where it goes. But it is strange. Okay, so bear with me as I read through this. I'm reading it on the screen here in front of me. So, painter, painter. Nothing seems more appropriate today than thinking community. Nothing more necessary, demanded, and heralded by a situation that joins in a unique epochal knot the failure of all communisms with the misery of new individualisms. Roberto Espieto, Communitas, The Origin and Destiny of Community, 2010. So I bought that book at the time just to get more research on this notion of community. I also want to say that when I'm commissioned to write an essay like this, my tendency is to write something critical. And in some cases, the aims of the people who are commissioning me, I'm asking the question why all the time. I'm not going to go alongside what the commissioners are asking me to write. I'm trying to find a purchase in which there's a kind of critical verve in the prose because it gets so boring, passive when you're not writing against the grain of something. Another quote: when this community dissolves, it leaves the impression that it could never have existed, even if it did exist. Maurice Blanchot, The Unavowable Community, 1988. I'll say that again. I stumbled over that. When this community dissolves, it leaves the impression that it could never have existed, even if it existed. Next, a fox knows many things, but a hedgehog knows one important thing. Archilochus, 6th century BCE. Last quote, or epigraph. It's very tiny content. Willem de Kooning in an interview. That was actually taken from a Susan Sontag essay, the most famous one, Against Interpretation, where she uses that quote as an epigraph for that essay. So here's the piece. I'm going to need a drink. What is it to paint in a city? This question, sorry, I'm going to expand this because I need to bring this closer. So, what is it to paint in a city? This is the question that has haunted and taunted me since Palace Projects Dublin directors Mark Cullen and Gavin Murphy first invited me to write this essay that accompanies their selection of Dublin city painters for the Zagreb Biennial of Painting 2021. In its five previous editions, the Zagreb Biennial of Painting has used the European city as a way to define and demarcate painting practice within a given national art scene. The participating artist's somewhat loose connection with the city determines their selection: pragmatic, political, economic. The reasons why the geographical parameter of the European city is being used to curate and locate European-wide painting practices within large, if not always capital urban centres is beside the point of this text. However, something can be philosophically gained from the identification and definition of painters and painting shepherded within a given city. An exhibition of paintings displayed and displaced in a gallery in Zagreb, paintings by Irish artists born, bred, educated, or active in Dublin City, will end up being defined in national terms rather than city limit terms. City limit terms make it much more complicated and enticing a proposition if we are to think beyond broad notions of gift shop nationality, which includes Guinness and leprechauns in our case. City limit paintings could invoke the fantasy of an art scene that fosters and generates individual styles or schools of painting conceived in reaction or in resistance to other individual painters or groups of painters. From this localized perspective, the Croatian observer might perceive what is playing out before them on these alien canvases as a symptom of artistic, social, and political togetherness in a city far from theirs. The same observer might imagine what we will tentatively call a community of artists, working with and against each other, even though we know following failed communism via the post-war philosophies of Georges Bataille, Maurice Blanchot, and Jean-Luc Nancy, that community is unavowable and inoperative, especially today when faced with the misery of new individualisms that proliferate social media, our current existential crisis. Of course, this has got worse now, like 5 years on, with the introduction of AI also. On first being invited to write this essay, I wondered what was the criteria for the selection of painters who would represent Irish painting in the Zagreb Biennial of Painting. I looked down the list and recognized all 25 painters. It would be a lie to say that I appreciated all 25 painters listed in terms of formal innovation or critical ambition. The same way all 25 painters do not appreciate one another formally or critically. Painters are especially harsh on their peers. What can be said is all 25 painters have attained varying visibility in the Dublin art scene. They represent different generations and art communities within the Dublin art scene, the Dublin city limits being the invisible border used to curtail the curatorial process. As community is something I want to discuss in terms of painting practice within and without the city, I will first define what I mean by community in a painting context by first defining what a painter is, what a city is, and what a community of influence is before approaching the primary question of this text: what is it to paint in a city? What is a painter? In a time when it seems artists play multiple roles rather than a unity of activity or a unit of activity, and when the weight of art history has been injected with helium, painter is a very different designation than artist. An artist is someone who is not defined by a medium but undefined via a way of being. Artists float above the media they pull from their quiver. The artist's idea or expression precedes and follows the medium so that content and form collide to form something new and undefined. The artist is metaphysical. The painter is defined by the object of paint and action of painting. Painters are stable but necessary glitches in the grand scheme of curated things, a schema where critical if not market value is placed on the transdisciplinary. Confronted with this unit of activity, one that is bound by an edge, a limit, but like a chessboard on which infinite moves lead towards an abstract egg game, the professional shapeshifters of culture find the painter an absurdity in a gene pool that values dynamism between media and human interlocutors. Painting may be the very thing that Oscar Wilde was thinking when he defined art as the purest form of individualism. If we go along with the line, no matter how absurd this line of thought may be, that being a painter is an absurdity in the postmodern and panesthetic world of anything and everything goes, then the exclusive banner of painting biennial further compounds and expounds the idea that the painter remains a hedgehog in means but a fox in message. Even though some, if not most, of the 25 painters representing painter within the cloudy city limits of Dublin would rather be called an artist over a painter, a fox over a hedgehog. And yet, some of these painters, not all, have made outroads beyond the city limits of the object and action of paint to spawn a type of sculptural excess that wanders beyond the paradigm of painting. But this excess is still determined and reeled in by the body of painting around which this excess orbits and without which would slip away into space. Sorry, you drink. The curators have selected 25 painters based on the self-determined and publicly affirmed value of painting in their painting practice. The two curators are not painters. This is significant. As non-painters, they may have easily sided with painting practices that expand outward towards a spatial excess to the detriment and perhaps disintegration of the painted object. Beside taste, timing, vicinity, and visibility, if two painters were invited to select 25 painters for the Zagreb Biennial, they might, in a rhetorical sense, try to promote painting's playful agency beyond its delimiting edge by selecting some expansive painters. But painters of all artists, if we can call them that here, value or perhaps love is a better word, painting above all other mediums. A painter's painter is a real thing, not a fantasy. Further, painters value other painters' judgments and observations above curators or other agents in the art scene. To be recognized by a fellow painter is everything to the painter. As one painter said to me in an interview when asked about an audience for painting, I want, I paint for other painters. Sorry. So he said, as one painter said to me in an interview when asked about an audience for painting, I want, oh, I said it again, I paint for other painters. And I can mention who that artist is now, or name that artist, and that was Dougal Mackenzie in an interview. Um, it was a kind of interview with three artists from Belfast for VAI over 10 years ago. So, what is a city? The painter, as has been discussed, is determined by the medium of paint and doubly so by the curatorial context of a biennial of painting. But what of a city in terms of determining painting practice? Here, in this biennial, painting is not merely a decorative vista or filler against the focal point of a curatorial sound and socially aware serious art. No, painting is claiming a space for itself to court in the absence of everything but the city, keeping in mind the city is a curatorial excuse, exercise, or excess, rather than a serious context to lump a selection of painters together in an exhibition. That said, the city used as it is as a defining perimeter is significant and somehow secure in itself. Regional painting practice seems less critically relevant if indeed art is a product of the individual conditioned, determined, and corrupted by society rather than something that lies deep and detached from society within the individual. Painting in relation to the city is less of a fantasy, less caught up in the idiosyncrasies of the individual outsider or misfit, and more in touch with the comings and goings of a world and its people and their politics, a society always on the move and always changing vis-a-vis the perspective of the transient painter who moves through the city, belonging and not belonging, alone and not alone. There is a realism in the use of the city as a curatorial device, a realism connected with the hard institutions of ambition, audience, market, and survival in the city, not the soft subjectivity that lies beyond the city limits, where the painter seems to disavow institutions while also ache for their attention. The city manifests less of itself and more of the fantasy that lies beyond the city limits, a space without limits that drags up images of the outsider artists painting away to their hearts and obsessions content, with a symbolism and mythology naive and original, but in keeping with the naivety and originality of the outsider artists. Realism and fantasy get enmeshed, where the city limits meet their end, where the Lynchian highway drifts away into the darkness, where social agency is lost and individual self is gained for the good or ill of the individual or painting. Society, to the concentrated degree of the city, can be a corrupting influence on the individual, as Jean-Jacques Rousseau maintained. If authenticity is a rejection or turning away from society and the other, then what is authenticity in terms of painting? The authentic painter is characterized by the outsider artist, individual, naive, uneducated, unsophisticated, but original in an outsider artist kind of way. The outsider artist is someone removed from society because they cannot help themselves from being corrupted by external influences. It is way too easy to be led astray beyond the city limits into the romance and fantasy of the outsider painter, whereas the painter who resides within the competitive and crowded city limits resists such mythologies. The former, far from the madding crowd, fuses into something both real and fantastic, an authentic self realized in the symbiosis between being and painting. I need another drink. So this is the last kind of subsection, and it's titled, What is a Community of Influence? This has taken me longer than I thought, but anyway, bear with me. It is difficult to return from the fantastic hinterland beyond the city limits to try to answer the primary question of this text. What is it to paint in a city? A question we have splintered into three thorns. What is a painter? What is a city? And finally, what is a community of influence? And this is the real question I want to bring up around um, Palace and their use of community versus the individual. I also talked about this a little bit in my critical reflection on funding, on successful funding or not. Anyway, the ideal of community is not just this writer's fantasy, but the fantasy of every artist who has placed romantic or individual or influential weight on schools or movements in painting from Leipzig to New York. Historical precedents also exist in philosophy during the liberation in Paris, when the efflorescence of the French philosophical avant-garde blossomed in the wake of the world wars, in the journalism of Albert Camus, and existentialism of Jean-Paul Sartre. The idea of artists coming together in the art scene as lover artists in the bars and cafes of the city is somehow a much better image of the artist than that of the isolated genius artist reinventing the wheel on the foothills of creation without a community of influence. The influence of the other in real terms, on the ground, inside the studio, the gallery, the bars and cafes of the city, up close and in person, must infiltrate the heart, head, and paint of the painter. It must! Exclamation mark. The other proffers the artist permission to paint within and beyond themselves. The painter's community is a community of influence. But this community of influence is not a public community. It's not the public community of the hippie generation that, through the coming together of public protest in body and spirit, proclaimed a community through love, not war. Nor is it a community of the Occupy movement that, as Jacques Rancière observes, populates and protests through an inactive body. The art community is coy. It is a by proxy community of influence that rubs up and against the other stress. Sorry. The art community is coy. It is a by proxy community of influence that rubs up and against the other to stress the predilections of the individual artist. The painter borrows, begs, steals influence from the visible and recognizable in the community, or recognized in the community. The community of influence plays out privately in the art scene, and those influences are subsumed beneath the painter's want and will to be different. Not too different, mind you, but different enough to be recognized as different but the same. A painting is recognized via the recognition of the other. However, the influence has to be almost unconscious or displaced for the recognition to manifest itself in the eye and memory of the community. Appropriation of and by predecessors and peers is a cultural phenomenon that is both valued and rejected by cultural producers. That's another term that I've been using a lot recently, or in the last 5 years, as this text testifies to cultural producers rather than artists, because that's what we are. Take, for instance, fashion designer Tom Ford's riposte to, I can't pronounce this, is a Miuccia Prada, after she denied the influence of her predecessor. Quote, Miss Prada said in many interviews about the show that she had never been inspired by the work of her predecessor. Well, Mr. Ford said, Coco Chanel said that creativity is the art of concealing your sources. So that's from the New York Times in 2012. The community of influence is there but not there, evident but veiled. Painting lives off a community of influence by both negating and eliciting influence. The community of influence is private. I have an asterisk after that, but that must be towards the end. So the community of influence is private. I forget what I wrote. Sorry. So the community of influence in painting is nearly always a community of two, One precursor painter is the spine of the belated painter's practice, the spine being a useful metaphor to get across the formal structure that undergirds a painting practice, but also the spine, bravery, needed to break the same influential structure in order for the painter to make such influence their own. The individual painter sits in the driving seat, carpooling influence, with the back seat full, and the significant influential order riding shotgun, whispering love letters in the ear. Quote, the community of lovers has as its, sorry, quote, the community of lovers has as its essential aim the destruction of society, whereas or wherever a temporary community arises between two beings who are or are not made for each other, a war machine is constructed, or rather the possibility of a disaster which, albeit only in infinitely small dosage, carries the threat of universal annihilation. That is by Maurice Blanchot, The Unavowable Community. Um, At the time of writing this, and we were in the middle of COVID, he's saying COVID, the pandemic sounds better for some reason. I was reading Blanchot, I was reading Jean-Luc Nancy, I was reading Roberto Espioto, and they were all talking about community, and I was very aware why I was thinking about community because how we were isolated. And these were really, these writings really helped me through that time for some reason. Um, and this is where philosophy becomes really important, I think. Anyway, love is the thing. From Blanchot, we can equate love with the community of influence, a love that perpetuates the individuality of the painter, especially the ideal of the first love. That is, if you have ever been subsumed by the love of and for another person, not just a casual sort of love, love that is more a demand for reciprocated affection or attention, or love that is spoken while looking at the world over the shoulder of the lover. No, the first love doesn't allow for the outside world. It lives off the fullness one feels in the presence of the other and the negation of everything swirling around the other. The first love is shoulderless, intestinal, a monster with two backs. It's not attention seeking or public. The first love crouches on the hands and knees, bends the spine, sucks face without coming up for air, fresh air. The first love stinks of itself and nothing else. The first love is one, not two. I actually like that. That's mine. The community of influence wherein the painter becomes a lover and hater is their appropriation of the other painter. Sorry. The community of influence wherein the painter becomes a lover and hater in their appropriation of the other painter is analogous with the brand spanking newness of the boy girl, girl girl, boy boy relationship that turns its back on family, friends, and society to become the monster with two backs. The healthy individual turns their back on the mirror, unlike the sick narcissist who can't turn away from their reflection. It is what Blanchot wrote following Bataille that interests me here. Sorry. It is what Blanchot wrote following Bataille that interests me here in relation to painting and the city, painting being something private and digestive rather than public and productive. The community of two lovers, communities are always small, is something that hungers and lusts. I suppose I should say the community of two lovers, communities are always small. Real communities are always small. Is something that hungers and lusts for love, and all is spin-off emotions of hate. Sorry. The community of two lovers, communities are always small, or real communities are always small, is something that hungers and lusts for love, and all is its spin-off emotions of hate, fear, vulnerability, lust, rage. We must not forget that painters hate their influence as much as they love them. Painters are the best critics of their kind. I'll repeat that because I really believe that. Painters are the best critics of their kind. They first embrace and then bury the community of influence to fashion and individualism. God, I'm losing it here. The, they first embrace and then bury the community of influence to fashion an individualism that stands by itself alone. So, last section, thank God. What is it to paint in a city? I think I've said a lot of the stuff around community that is really important there in relation to what I was speaking to in my critical reflection on Palace. But I'll end here with this. Painter. The Curator Group exhibition of American and European painters at the Walker Art Centre in 2013 is still my favourite exhibition title in any medium and can help us to approach the question, what is it to paint in a city? But not for the reasons the curators titled the exhibition Painter, which has something to do with the generative power of painting as a means rather than an end in and of itself. No, the reason Painter still resonates 8 years on from its inception in my brain is that it emphatically echoes what I have just discussed as the duality of the painter in terms of the community of influence and the lover artist, but also the tautology that painter invokes as both an absurd repetition of the painter working within the limited perimeter of the edge of the painting, and a narcissistic reflection of the painter trapped in their own reflection, which ends up not being their reflection at all through the appropriation of the community of influence. In one sense, painters bury themselves beneath their influence, or at least side by side. The same repetition of tautology surfaces in American painter Willem de Kooning's words when he says painting has very tiny content. There is emphasis, but also tautology. Isn't one very tiny enough? Isn't one painter enough? No, being a painter is always relative and in a sense inauthentic. Literally echoes this relativity. Painter also proclaims itself as if shouting like a manifesto. Painting is both private and public, narcissistic and generous, but firm in its need to be part of and apart from the community of influence. What is it to paint in a city as opposed to outside the city? Ends up being a banal question. If we shorn the tail in a city from the question, we are left with the head. What is it to paint? As this writer is a lapsed painter and now relapsed painter who painted for 20 odd years inside and outside college, within and without the city, the question, what is it to paint, is difficult to answer. If I were a writer looking and thinking from outside the act of painting like an object, like the farmer does at a city from the locus of the untouched landscape, I would have lots to say. But the subjectivity that drowns you in the act of painting blindfolds you from what it is to paint. To paint is beset by a mire of subjectivity, but if we look at what we are really asking via rather than vis-a-vis the question, what is it to paint, we can see there is a manifesto-like quality, like very tiny, and painter, to the tone of the question, as there always has been with regards to the history of painting. As if to paint, since in its inception as a form of manual labor in the service of worship, was always a product of the individual's imagination and desire to continue to resist the status quo of the democratic, which infers community and equality in the wake of the individual and liberty. Within Dublin city limits, a city ribboned by grey motorways and greyer literature from James Joyce to Samuel Beckett, a city of words that circumscribe it like the knotted frames of the painted histories of other European cities, a city caught for so long in the infinite loop of religion, a city of brown canal deltas hemmed by green grass, white scum, and rusted orange shopping trolleys, a city wherein the currents flow inwards against the politics that trickle outwards into the countryside where real power also resides and rests, a city that reigns on the forget-me-nots and empty syringes that pinch the gaze on the boardwalks of the murky river Liffey, a city of painters that have always quarantined in their studios while looking sideways at the invisible bar. No, sorry. A city of painters that have always quarantined in their studios while looking sideways at the visible painters hosted by the gallery walls and minds of curators. A city where the painter is part of and apart from a community of public enemies and private friends. A city of promiscuous foxes desiring monogamy and hedgehogs desiring promiscuity. End. Okay. I just want to go back to that asterisk sentence, and that's at the very end. Just one note. Um, I don't have any end notes here, which is interesting. I was kind of against them. Anyway, communities in the public realm are always making a statement about being a community. They are rhetorical communities, not real communities. Public communities are political, whereas private communities don't need the public to sustain them. They feed off each other, like Bataille's destructive community of lovers. There is a self-sustenance playing out in the private community, one that feeds and sheds individuality, whereas the public community that makes its publicness the thing is performing community for everyone else to see, to desire, to envy. The real community does not leave a trace, whereas the ideology or fantasy of community tries to impress one on the public. It is a lie. Okay, I'm going to just close that down. So I'll end there. I think that's that last line, it is a lie, this idea of the public community rather than the community of lovers, of two lovers, or one, or a community that is hidden from plain sight. Like, because we have become more public as artists, um, on our social media feeds or whatever, I've also become more public in this feed. So, but I'm coming from a very individual, uh, you know, one artist called these sermons, and they are kind of like that. They're coming from this kind of pulpit, and I'm spouting all this stuff. Um, but I don't see a community out there really, or community making. I see that as a branding of something that is very competitive, whether it's in public funding or in the envy of being in a private space, private commercial gallery space, being represented by a gallery. And on the ground, when I'm talking to artists, there's always this hunger and famine and a desire also when hunger and famine isn't there. When everything is satisfied, there's still a desire, a want for something. And there's a competition in there. So community is a strange thing to be that has been kind of proliferated in the art scene over and over again. I think that's why I wrote this piece at that time, because I was also thinking about community in relation to the pandemic, about artists not coming together. And then this biennial, which was, talking about a community of painters within a city limits situation. And but really, was that a community of painters? I'm not sure. So yeah, I'm going to leave it there because I'm absolutely wrecked after reading that. And it's only 7 o'clock in the morning or something like that. So yeah. Anyway, thanks for listening. I hope my reading wasn't too difficult to discern. I know I stumbled a lot, but it was just, I was asked to write, I think, 1,500 words, and I ended up writing 3,500 or 4,000 words. Um, that's, I had a lot to say about that, but it was a really good piece to write. I have to thank Mark and Gavin for inviting me to do it, um, and to be part of that Zagreb trip, which was really, it kind of, it was a temporary community, a temporary doing it together. But it was fun. Um, okay, I'll leave it. And thanks for listening. See you again.